So back in January of 2026, the city of Minneapolis found itself at the absolute center of this fierce national debate. It really became a flashpoint where federal power clashed with local life, and it all culminated in a tragic, fatal encounter right on a city street. Let's break down how this incredibly complex and explosive situation all went down.
And this quote from a local official, man, it just says it all, doesn't it? This really captures the feeling on the ground. For a lot of people in Minneapolis, this wasn't just law enforcement showing up. The massive federal presence felt like something else entirely, something much more imposing.
Right at the heart of this whole story is this fatal encounter, but with two completely, totally different narratives. So on one hand, you have the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, claiming an individual came at their officers with a handgun. But then you have the video evidence, which seems to show he was just holding a cell phone.
So who was this person? Well, his name was Alex Pretty, and he wasn't just a statistic. He was a 37-year-old ICU nurse, someone who literally cared for veterans in his community. It's also a key fact that he was a lawful gun owner and had a concealed carry permit.
What's just so shocking is how fast this all escalated, and it was all caught on video. At 9:05 in the morning, you see Pretty filming. Just moments later, he's being pepper sprayed and wrestled to the ground by about 6 agents. Then you see this critical moment. An agent takes a gun from Pretty. It's only after he's been disarmed, while he's on the ground, that multiple agents fire at least 10 shots.
So you have to be asking, how did things even get to this point? To really understand this tragic incident, we need to zoom out and look at the operation that brought all these agents to the city in the first place. It was called Operation Metro Surge.
And the scale here was just massive. We're talking 3,000 federal agents sent to Minnesota. Now, to put that number in perspective, they outnumbered the entire Minneapolis police force 5-1. Let that sink in for a second.
So why the huge surge? Well, officially, the government said it was to arrest undocumented immigrants who had criminal records and to look into social services fraud. But a lot of local officials and critics, they weren't buying it. They alleged a totally different motive, political payback against a state the president had publicly called corrupt and crooked.
Okay, so you have this huge federal presence. What does that actually do to a city? What did it feel like for the people just trying to live their lives? Well, it basically transformed daily life into something a lot of people didn't even recognize.
The impact just rippled out everywhere. You had schools going into lockdown. An estimated 80% of immigrant-owned businesses just shut their doors. The bus stops in the morning, normally packed with workers, were suddenly empty. There were even reports of federal agents inside hospitals, which, as you can imagine, terrified patients who were just there for medical care. And this quote from a local teacher named Kate, it just hits you right in the gut. She told reporters, "We are living in a nightmare. It's dystopian." I mean, that really says everything about the climate of fear that was gripping the city.
But here's the thing. The community didn't just hide. They organized, and in some pretty incredible ways. You had citizen patrols with whistles standing on street corners, watching for ICE. A local sex shop, believe it or not, completely transformed itself into a donation center for food and supplies. All these networks popped up to document what was happening and help families pay their rent and buy groceries.
And you can bet this didn't stay a local story for long. The killing of Alex Pretty basically lit a fuse that ran all the way to Washington, D.C., and it kicked off this high-stakes political showdown that threatened to shut down the entire government.
Right away, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer drew a hard line in the sand. He basically announced that his party would block the entire government funding package if it included money for the Department of Homeland Security. That's the agency in charge of ICE.
And you might think, okay, is that just political talk? Nope. This was not an empty threat. Senator Patty Murray, who is a huge player on the committee that actually writes these funding bills, she came out and said the exact same thing. She was not going to support the bill as it stood.
The response from the White House, it was immediate. And it was a completely different story. Just a few hours after the shooting, senior advisor Stephen Miller went public, claiming with no evidence that Alex Pretty was a domestic terrorist who had tried to assassinate federal law enforcement.
So you've got these two sides completely dug in, absolutely refusing to budge. What does that mean? It means the chances of a partial government shutdown just went through the roof, putting the funding for huge parts of the federal government at risk. So when you peel back all these layers, the operation, the killing, the politics, what you find at the very core is this fundamental constitutional question about where federal power ends
and where local power begins.
And to really get our heads around this, a great place to look is the Congressional Research Service. Think of them as the nonpartisan experts who explain these exact kinds of legal tangles directly to Congress itself. So they know what they're talking about.
Okay, so at the very heart of this legal battle is the 10th Amendment. You can think of it as the basic rule book for who has what power in the U.S. And it's pretty simple. If the Constitution doesn't specifically give a power to the federal government, like, say, day-to-day policing of a city, then that power belongs to the states. This is the entire foundation of the lawsuit that Minnesota ended up filing.
Now, the federal government does have a kind of superpower, right? Money. It can use funding to influence what states do, but even that has rules. The Supreme Court has put up some serious guardrails. The conditions have to be clear, they have to be related to the goal, and, this is the big one for this story, they can't be coercive. The pressure can't be so great that it basically forces a state to comply.
And what happened in Minneapolis? Well, it's like a real-world stress test for these very principles. It forces us all to ask whether a federal operation can essentially take over a city's resources and just override local authority.
Which brings us back to that one huge critical question that this whole story raises. In a country that's built on a balance of power, where exactly is that line between enforcing federal law and protecting local life? What happened on the streets of Minneapolis suggests that line is dangerously, terrifyingly unclear.